When I first began integrating culturally responsive research into all areas of my courses, we were at the height of COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement, and I was writing a textbook on Introduction to Qualitative Research. And my publisher and I had agreed that I would write an updated version of qualitative research, and I was trying to think about how to capture the needs of my current students. It was very clear that they had a sense of critical urgency, that not to say other groups don't have this sense of critical urgency, but particularly my younger students had a clarion call. They were very sick of standard white dominant research messaging that often read as that the researcher was completely removed from the Research Act. So I did first propose my book as being grounded in critical race theory, including critical whiteness and anti-racism. This proposal was accepted, but simultaneously in Virginia, my home state, the governor had indicated that no textbooks in higher education could be purchased for curriculum that were based on critical race theory. Now, all three of my degrees are from Virginia. One is from a small Mennonite liberal arts university, another from James Madison, and the final from Virginia Tech. And so I couldn't imagine that my colleagues and former students wouldn't be able to engage with any of my texts. So I thought about this for a long time, scoured the literature, deepened my understanding, and decided to move the major construct, to culturally responsive research, which is a very good connection for me because I have a textbook on culturally responsive research ethics. So it fit naturally for me. And this, of course, all pulls from culturally responsive pedagogy, which many of you will be familiar with. This story, I think, underscores the pressing nature of critical research, where increasingly we're being given a narrow lens through which we can consider research. I teach all my courses, so any kind of researcher can engage with them. So this includes people that want to use traditional methods that are time-honored, such as traditional phenomenology, traditional grounded theory, but these all also have current critical veins also. So there's critical phenomenology, and certainly there's critical uses of grounded theory. And the emphasis of this course and the course that's related to it, the following course, is on how to move this into culturally responsive, critical types of research. What I want to do is amplify the voices or add to these voices in these critical areas, pulling on their rich affordances for researchers. And I'm assuming that you bring from your own area constructs such as cultural competency or cultural relevant pedagogy that you can also infuse into research. I'm going to start with the tenet one another. An unrestrained acknowledgement of the other, a genuine turn to the other is needed. And this quote is from Avakan. This idea is one another, not the other. So throughout the history of research, there's a horrific past where we historically researched others as this exotic, different foreigner, often as broke, seeming them as kind of odd, peculiar, something that, air quote, we might think of their intellectual zoo for us to observe. Words in this literature area include othered, othering, otherness, otherization, study of the, air quote, foreign other. Othering is a process that identifies those that are thought to be different from oneself or the mainstream, and it can reinforce and reproduce positions of domination and subordination. And I would change that to say it does reinforce and reproduce this. Othering dehumanizes, objectifies, and distances the research participant as an exotic specimen from the researcher. Othering is powerful, and it's very hard to sway or influence, since it's not only the way we mark people as either other or with us in identities and experiences, but also the way we identify ourselves in relation to others. But Schwant reminds us that even through critical research, culturally responsive research, we cannot escape othering through a critical stance. All research is based at some point on the attempt to understand the other, something we don't know. Without this, as we go to move towards this understanding, there would be no other once we understand. So I'm suggesting what we need to move to then is one another, an understanding of one another in research to the extent possible. What is needed to do this then is a deep reflexive consideration of the self and a genuine turn to the other, characterized by attentive listening, consideration, collaboration, co-creation, and relationship with one another. In order to do this, we need to deepen our sense of intersectionality, both of ourselves and of those that we tend to conduct research with. And I'll give you a personal example. So I'm Swiss German American, and I have a deep understanding culturally of what it means to specifically be Swiss German American Mennonite. So that's an even different intersection. But what does my whiteness mean? What privilege does it automatically accord me? What biases do I have? What assumptions do I bring? For example, as one part of my culture, I'm very aware of how time is a commodity for me as a wealthy, educated white woman. My understanding of time is definitely part of my racial identity. As you're considering your personal identities and those of the people you research, you want to think about how those identities are integrated and how do they shift and change depending on the context. So the ways I play out my whiteness as a mom in my home and neighborhood in Colorado might be very different than the ways I play out my whiteness when visiting my home in Virginia, or how I might play out what it means to be wife enact what it means to be white on a university campus. So you'll want to consider how are these identities integrated? How do these identities change and shift contextually? The impact of identities on you as a researcher and your research participants, the impact of the research participants' identities on their research experiences. And then you need to have a commitment to do pre-research about and with those you plan to do research with, reading up on groups and their historical relationships to research, but most importantly, consulting with community members and scholars prior to the research commencing. Critical whiteness. I think that initially critical whiteness can almost have the feeling that, oh, is this a dog whistle? And so by a dog whistle, I mean something that we say to distract or make a conversation more dense and is used in a destructive and undermining way. However, critical whiteness is a genuine theory that if you dig deep into it, it has people of all races and ethnicities that are working with it. But the goal is to work towards dismantling white dominance and understanding how white dominance is a systemic presence in research, both in the research we conduct, also with researchers historically, and in the systems that we do research about. Critical whiteness in research is a theoretical stance that all researchers can use. It's a commitment to researching and seeking to change the structures that create white privilege. For white researchers, it's an acknowledgement of what our white privilege is and how we have benefited from it historically and continue to benefit from it contemporarily. Being attentive to perspectives other than ours, being open to ideas, stories, and perspectives that we may feel defensive about or initially not understand. It's a candid assessment of the space we occupy in higher education and a consideration of how we got into these spaces and how sustained and collaborative effort and how we can create sustained and collaborative effort to create space where all can thrive. If you want to read more about critical whiteness, I would suggest you could peruse the Journal of Whiteness and Education and get a very quick sense of the rich research that's taking place in this area. Dr. Cheryl Matthias and Janice McKay say, until we are willing to break down whiteness, the hope of racial justice and anti-racism becomes a faint balloon, rising beyond the horizon and drifting away. Story is sacred. So story is sacred has two important aspects. The first is reverence. As researchers, we need to revere the stories participants have shared with us. And in this case, by reverence, I mean a deep and abiding respect, regard, or honor. Secondly, it's a commitment to look for those moments in stories where research participants share memories they return to, that they turn to glimpse the transcendent, that inform who they are becoming, or to address life's big wonder or small moments of wonders. This is probably the one that I think might be the most difficult for people to think of as researchers because we often have been trained in objectivist environments where we suspend the sacred nature of our humanity and that of the people we research. So I'd like to give you a more extensive example. So my mom died a quite a difficult death about 8 years ago, over 9 days from a heart surgery that didn't work as it was supposed to. So when we arrived back in Colorado, we were an exhausted family and needed to pick up all our professional responsibilities and catch up from those. And we were highly removed from our extended family. And I thought to myself, what in the world do we do to honor mom in the midst of all of this? And I thought about a story that I could tell my children because it's hard to know how to include children in what extent during a death like this that they're very separated from because they're not allowed to come into these kinds of medical spaces, in these highly medical spaces where they're continuing to work with the person. So I told them this story. While mom was dying, she was dying over Easter weekend, and she was a very religious Christian, and that's a very important holiday to her. So I had downloaded every Easter hymn that Mennonites had ever sang, any Easter song I could think of, onto my phone, and had been playing those for her. Then I also sang many of the songs for her, and I became completely exhausted, and I was worried that as I fell asleep, that my phone would somehow get lost in all of the medical care that was coming in and out to her. And at that time, I was the only family member that was being allowed in the room, and other family members were coming as quickly as they could, and we would have exchanged spaces then. So as I fell asleep, I took my phone back to me and stuck it in my pocket. And suddenly I woke up with a nurse shaking me, and she said, "Your mom's speaking." And these were the last words that mom spoke. She said to me, "Music, music." And I realized she wanted me to turn the recording back on. And so I turned the music back on and also took turns singing to her between the hymns and the different songs. And so I was able to take this story of music, how humanity shares music, and music is one of the last ways that we can often communicate, even both through the enjoyment of it. And I saw with my dad's dementia, he could completely sing songs where he couldn't necessarily convey his thoughts to me. And so I was able to share this story of music to my children and then also share some of the stories that their grandmother had so much appreciated it and help them glimpse this transcendent moment as she moved into being completely unconscious and then subsequently died. And I see this as underlying both the big wonder and then also small moments of wonders as we think about life and death. And certainly you can immediately see the sacred aspect of this story. Then I said to my family, what do we do to honor mom? I wanted some kind of memorial. And she had always made lemon meringue pie. And so the kids and I learned how to make lemon meringue pie together. I had never made them hardly at all, even though I am a big cook. It is a very difficult and loving pie to make. And so for any of our special celebrations, that's what we make. And so we moved this sacred story into a ritual that we do. And so this is the kind of questions and moments that we want to listen to when we're interviewing people about the topics that we have of interest. If they share these, that we can give space for these types of stories. If you look at my larger work, I've written more about the lemon meringue pie story. Story is sacred. Then the final idea, commitment, brings all of these tenets together. And it's an extensive effort to understand yourself. So we're thinking about our identities before we would ever research others. And this is one, all of these underlie each other. This is one way that we honor the sacred nature of human research. We don't have the audacity to go and ask people to share. I'm always amazed that they're willing to share so deeply about themselves on so many different kinds of topics until we've tried to understand ourselves better in relation to the topics of interest. Commitment is a sincere attempt to create research with the research participants and not of the research participant. We're not enacting it on them. This may include, but it's certainly not limited to co-constructed research, collaborative research, participant action research, and critical research methods. And I'll talk a little bit more about collaborative research in the related course. It's a commitment to an integration of moments throughout the research where the research participants may express their experience with the research and how the research might be amended for the current research or for future research experiences. So as a research methodologist, I place moments throughout the research where I ask them, is the research clear to them? How the forms worked? How's the process working? Do they still want to be in the research? This is an idea of seeing consent as an ongoing process and not a one-off. And this type of data is something research methodologists collect to help to develop work that all researchers can draw on to improve our study. But I would strongly suggest that all researchers should do this as we check in. How is the process of the research going for you to the research participant? And this certainly is a commitment because it's an added layer. I want to do a brief aside to quantitative researchers. While I contend that any type of researcher can use culturally responsive research and should at some level, this talk is, of course, completely from a qualitative lens because that's my specialty. But I would say that I teach all types of researchers in my research ethics course. And as part of my work there, I've noticed that culturally responsive research is burgeoning in quantitative ways. And so I just give you one example here of quant crit. I've also seen queer quant crit, for example, and then this one's more of a race and ethnicity quant crit. And it has 5 tenets of quant crit, which include recognizing the centrality of racism and how it's intertwined in the fabric of society, and acknowledging that numbers are not neutral, since there can be a lack of objectivity in how data is collected. Understanding that the categories of race are not natural or given, and that race can be socially constructed. Conceding that data cannot speak for itself because biased people need to be who analyzes it, and orienting the focus of research around social justice and equity. So I would challenge you to look at publications such as the one pictured here, look at the reference list at the end of the discussion, of course, and start to dig into these areas. If you tend not to do qualitative research, you're a quantitative researcher or mixed methodologist or evaluator. So take a moment and screenshot this slide or pause the course, and we'll do reflexive writing. And we'll have moments for this in both, excuse me, I started to say all three, but in both of the webinars, both of the courses that I'm conducting. Take a moment to reflect about what major identities you and the research participants you conduct research with hold. If you're in a group, a course taking this writing, or a course taking this course with me, take time to discuss the reflexive writings. Create a written reflection about the following questions. What are these identities? How are these identities similar or different? How might these identities intersect? Which of these identities have power in society or are marginalized? How might these identities impact the researcher-research participant relationship? How might you learn more about the identities research participants might hold? And then anything else you would like to write about. So what's up next? We're going to look at the qualities of culturally responsive qualitative researcher. I'll specifically review the one of joyful and have an exemplar of joy in research.